All right, what's up, dude? It's Friday! I've lost count as to how many days we have been doing online learning, but it doesn't matter. It's the end of week 5, and we only have, I think, 3 more weeks left. That is amazing. Okay, just a very quick and brief announcement before guided practice. I wanted to give you guys an update on how we have been doing this week. Okay, so, as of Monday, we were at 58 scholars who had their work complete, which was actually pretty amazing. That was much, 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 much better than last week. So now let's go ahead and quickly update. Oops. Let's go ahead and update our graph. Let's see how much better we are doing. Um, Actually, really great scholars. So remember last week we were like, woo, like this big old roller coaster. And now we have more of a nice straight line, but we still see scholars start to decline throughout the week. So this line is much, much better than it was last week. I'm so pumped and excited, scholars. So make sure you finish all of your work this week, including today's review. Friday tends to be a tricky day for a lot of us. So amazing job. Go ahead and continue the video for your guided practice. Okay, scholars, for today's Friday review, we're actually just going to review 3 questions from yesterday's quiz that I noticed was the most tricky for all of us. So we're going to work really, really, really hard to be drawing models, but more specifically to really carefully read and understand each story problem. Make sure you have your paper and your pen ready to go, and let's go ahead and read the first story problem about Christopher. Take about 30 seconds to read it on your own, and then I will read it aloud. Okay, it says, Christopher read 5/8 of his book before dinner. After dinner, he read another 1/8. How much of his book does he have left to read? So there's a couple of things that we know in the story, and what we do know in the story is we know how much Christopher read before dinner, and we know how much he read after dinner. But let's carefully read that question again. How much of his book does he have left to read? When you're thinking about that question, has Christopher read his entire book? No. So then that question is telling us that there is a specific amount that he still has to read before he's completely done with the book. Now, before we start to make some annotations, I have one more question, which is, if Christopher read the entire book, how many eighths would that be? If you were thinking 8/8, you're correct. When we're thinking about reading an entire book, Christopher is actually breaking up the chapters into different groups. And in this case, he broke it up into 8 equal groups. That basically means that if he reads the entire book, he's breaking it up into 8 sections so that he doesn't read the whole entire thing at once. We do this all the time in guided reading and in narrative. We read parts of the book, and we don't necessarily have time to read the whole thing. So 8/8 would be the entire book. So let's go ahead now and start to make some annotations. The first annotation we should make is how much you read before and after dinner. So I'm going to write before dinner, and he read 5/8 of the book. And I'm actually going to write 5/8 of the whole book. Okay, and then after dinner, he read 1/8 of the whole book. So now let's draw a picture to represent what he read before dinner and what he represent after dinner. And remember, we had to remind ourselves what would be the entire book. Well, the entire book would be, that's right, 8/8 would be one whole book. So now let's draw a picture that represents eighths. I'm always going to use rectangles, scholars. For me, that's easiest to work with is a rectangle. And since I have graph paper, I'm also just going to look at my grid lines right here to help me find those 8 equal spaces. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. If you don't have graph paper, one really great way of starting this off is essentially drawing one whole rectangle, cutting your rectangle in half because you now have 2 pieces. And if you cut your rectangles half pieces in half again, you now have 4 pieces. And if you were to cut the fourths in half as well, you would now get eighths. Pretty cool, right? Okay, so let's now draw to represent 5/8 of the book. So 1/8, 2/8, 3/8, 4/8, and 5/8. Notice how I'm also not spending so much time drawing and coloring these in. I'm just trying to shade just to show the value. And then after dinner, he read another 1/8 of the whole book. So 1/8 would just be one piece. And I'm going to draw it in a different direction because I'm also going to label that this would be before dinner. That's why I wrote BD4. And then this little piece would be after dinner. Now remember, the question doesn't ask how much of the book has Christopher read so far. It's how much of the book does Christopher have left. So when we look at our picture, we just simply need to count what's left. It looks like these 2 pieces are what's left. So now let's count the pieces. What's the value or what's the size of each of these pieces? That's right, eighths. So let's count them by 1/8. 1/8, 2/8. So it looks like Christopher has 2/8 of the whole book left to read. Well, let's go back to our answer choices to see if we can find 2/8. A shows 3/4, B shows 1/2, C shows 3/8, and D shows 1/4. None of our answers match any of the answer choices. When this happens, scholars, especially when it comes to fractions, that can mean 2 things. It could mean 1, you might have gotten tricked and maybe you need to do another strategy, or 2, the question asks you to find an equivalent fraction to your answer, which is kind of like the simplest form. So now let's go ahead and reason about some of our answers. I'm actually going to write the answer choices on my paper. So the first one is 3/4. The second one is 1/2. The other one is 3/8. And the last answer choice is 1/4. So now we're actually going to use process of elimination to help us figure out which one of these would be the correct answer. Okay. When we're looking at our answer choices, we should be able to think of what could we eliminate first. What could be a value that we eliminate? And when you're thinking about this, try to think of one that is the most obvious one that it could not be. If you were thinking we could eliminate 3/8, I think that would be a really good choice. 3/8 could not be how much of the book Christopher has left to read because we know our answer is 2/8. And when we go back and look at our strategy, there's no evidence that makes us think that we actually miscalculated or that 2/8 would be equivalent to 3/8. So we're going to eliminate that as one of our choices. Well, now we have fourths and halves. And if you remember, I showed us how to cut the rectangle into half and then in fourths. When we cut it into half, we started in the middle. When we cut it into fourths, we cut each half also into half. So now that you're looking at the picture, you can see that these two pieces together, these two pieces together, these two pieces together, and these two pieces together equal a fourth. And since they equal a fourth, let's think about how many two of these pieces would be. So this would be 1/4, 2/4, 3/4, 4/4. So could this piece be equivalent to 1/2? No, it's too small. Could this piece be equivalent to 3/4? No, it's also still too small. Could these two pieces be equivalent to 1/2? Yes. 1/4 is equivalent to 2/8 because as you can see in our picture, when we take those eighths and we bring them together, they are the same size as 1/4. So then we can count this as 1/4, 2/4, 3/4, 4/4. So it looks like Christopher has 1/4 of the whole book left to read. Let's go ahead and select D. Go ahead and arrange your scratch piece of paper for question number 2 and then read it to yourself. Now that you've had some time to read the story problem to yourself, I'm going to go ahead and read it aloud. Kendall ran 4/8 of a mile before school and 2/8 of a mile after school. Which model below represents the fraction of a mile Kendall ran in all? So this one shouldn't be too tricky because the question's asking to find a fraction of a mile that Kendall ran in all. So what does that tell us about the amount Kendall ran before school and the amount that Kendall ran after school? Well, it tells us that we should combine those values to figure out what the fraction of a mile Kendall ran in all. So in your scrap piece of paper, you could start off with 4/8 plus 2/8. Well, 4/8 plus 2/8 equals, that's right, 6/8. Pretty easy. But let's draw a model because that is what we are looking for. We are looking for a model. So similar to what we did in the first question, I'm going to draw a rectangle with 8 equal size pieces. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. And remember, we can start off with splitting it in half, cut each half in half again. That would be now a fourth. And then we can cut each fourth in half as well to make eighths. Now let's just go ahead and show 6/8. 1/8, 2/8, 3/8, 4/8, 5/8, and 6/8. So our picture is asking us to find a value that looks exactly the same size as these 6/8 right here. So you might already be looking at your picture and thinking, ooh, that's more than a half. So when we go back and look at our models, we can actually use process of elimination to help. So we'll eliminate the models that do not look like 6/8, and then we'll start to evaluate the models that do look really close to 6/8. So when you're looking at your picture, the 6/8 look like A. No, A is way too small. It is an eighths, 2, 4, 6, 8, but it's only showing 1/8, so that can't be right. Do 6/8 Do 6/8 look like B? No, it's still a little too small, and just like we said, 6/8 is a little more than half, so it cannot be B. Does it look like C? No, C looks like it's equivalent to exactly 1/2. So it cannot be C. Could it be D? Looks like D is the closest value, but when we look at the model is showing 3/4. So if we go back to our picture, we can then see if we can find 3/4 in our picture. Well, if we did what we did in the beginning, we find the half, then we find our fourths, 1/4, 2/4, 3/4, 4/4. Looks like all of these pieces together are indeed equivalent to 3/4. So looks like D is our answer for number 2. Pow! Oh, I don't have a fun cursor today. Let's do that. What should I do? I could do Tom and Jerry. How about that? Sweet. That looks cool. Okay. All right, one more. Now this one was interesting because this one was also on an independent practice and it was on the quiz. This is also another question where you had to read it very carefully and find an equivalent fraction. I'm going to give you 3 minutes to solve this one again. Now for this one, you're going to be finding, again, an equivalent fraction. And that's right, an equivalent fraction, which means that when you read the story about Andrea and the beads, you notice that the values are in eighths. So we need to look for a value that is equivalent to eighths. Go ahead and go to work. Okay, so for number 3, it says Andrea made a bead necklace. In the necklace, 2/8 of the beads are blue and 6/8 of the beads are pink. So how many more pink beads did she use than blue beads? When we look through our answer choices, we see 8/8, 1/2, 1/4, and 3/16. So we have lots of different values there. So just like questions 1 and 2, we're going to continue with drawing a model to represent not only the values in each of the story problems, but also to compare them to find an equivalent fractions. To find a, that's right, equivalent fraction. Okay, so when I annotated the story, I noted how much blue beads there were and how many pink beads there were. So there were 2/8 of blue beads and 6/8 of the bracelet was pink. So we want to know how many more pink beads than blue. Because I wanted to figure out how many more, I actually decided to go ahead and draw 2 different pictures. One to represent the pink beads and one to represent the blue beads. And all of the questions that we had today were in eighths, so I'm really good at practicing and drawing eighths. And just like before, I started with half, then cutting each half in half to make fourths, and then cutting each fourth in half again to make eighths. So 1/8, 2/8, 3/8, 4/8, 5/8, 6/8, which represents the pink beads. 7, 8/8, which makes a whole bracelet. Then for the blue beads, it was 2/8. So the question is asking how many more pink than blue? When we look at our picture, we can tell that this is the amount that is more than the blue beads. Well, that is the same as 4/8. When we look at our answer choices, we don't have 4/8. We have 8/8, 1/2, 1/4, and 3/16, which still again means we're finding an equivalent fraction. So let's use process of elimination first. Could it be 8/8? No. So that's one we are definitely going to eliminate. Could it be 3/16? No. That is way too small because we know that 16ths are really small pieces. So now we have to think, could it be 1/2 or could it be 1/4? When we go back to our picture and we look at fourths, well, 1/4, 1/4, 1/4, and another 1/4. Well, do both of these together make 1/4? No, both of those together are actually 2/4. Well, 2/4 is not the same as 1/4. So then the answer choice has to be 1/2. 4/8 is indeed equal to 1/2. When we go back and we look at the picture, we can still see that 1/4 and another 1/4 is equal to half of the entire model of eighths. So for question number 3, our answer is 1/2. Amazing work this week, scholars, on fractions. Next week, we're going to continue with rounding. Then the following week, we're going to start something totally new. So if you have not finished any of your work this week, any of your guided practices, independent practices, or even your quiz from yesterday, please do that by Sunday night. Monday morning. Any incomplete or missing work will unfortunately receive a score of 0. If you need help with any of the work, please visit office hours with Ms. Hernandez or Ms. Rowe at 2:30 today. Happy Friday, scholars. See you later.